And welcome everyone. I'm so glad to see you all today. I've been really looking forward to this Lamplight lunch. My name is Brittany or Smash, depending on where you know me from. And I use she, her pronouns. I am the Congregational Engagement Manager at the Night Ministry. And this is our monthly series called Lamplight Lunches. And every month we talk about a different topic that intersects with our work at the Night Ministry. It's been a really exciting way, I think, to learn about things that are going on in our community and to connect with some other community organizations to hear and see about what incredible work folks are doing. And today we are really excited to celebrate Black Philanthropy Month. We have some other things going on throughout the year that we're going to focus on Black philanthropy, but we're excited to get rolling with it today with Jessyca Dudley. Jessyca, I'm so glad that you are here to join us today. Can you start by telling us a little bit about yourself, who you are, and what you do?
Absolutely. And thank you so much for the invitation to join you all for this conversation. Excited to be celebrating Black Philanthropy Month with you all. So I'm Jessyca Dudley. My background is actually in public health. I spent about 10 years in direct service and out in the field. And so had lots of nights where I was out on the streets and would see night ministry out. So excited to be with you today because I'm so familiar with the important work that you do. After some time in public health and doing direct service work, I made a pretty big left turn into philanthropy. Served as a program officer focused on gun violence prevention and justice reform at the Joyce Foundation, and then realized there were lots of opportunities to think differently about philanthropy and how it works through being in positions where you're helping to develop strategy and really change the system and how that works. And so I've spent the past about 4 or 5 years in strategy roles with Arabelle Advisors and now independently with a firm I started called Bold Ventures. I also am the director of Chicago African Americans in Philanthropy, which is most of what we'll probably talk about today. CAPE, as we affectionately call it, is the affinity group for Black funders and for folks working in the social sector in Chicago and across our Midwest region. And so we do a lot of work to make sure that there's a home for learning for folks, for relationship building, and also to really think strategically about how we shift resources to the Black community and really work to achieve racial equity.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jessyca. We'll get back to you in just a moment. I do want to give folks just a brief overview of Black Philanthropy Month for folks that may not have heard of it before. For us at the Night Ministry, we realize we're an organization that engages philanthropy, right, at many levels. So we really wanted to celebrate this month, to acknowledge it and to learn more about it by inviting Jessyca. But it's been around for 10 years. This is the 10-year anniversary of Black Philanthropy Month, which is really exciting. Folks all around the globe are celebrating that 10-year anniversary. It is observed every August. Like I said, it's a global celebration and a concerted campaign to elevate African descent giving. It was created by Dr. Jackie Bouvier Copeland and the Pan-African Women's Philanthropy Network. Since it was established, Black Philanthropy Month has reached over 17 million people across the globe, and it has become an increasingly year-round diasporic initiative that illuminates the ingenuity and transformative impact of generosity in Black communities. The primary aims of Black Philanthropy Month are informing, involving, inspiring, and investing in Black philanthropic leadership to strengthen African American and African descent giving in all of its forms for the benefit of our planet, our communities, our organizations, and our lives. If you want more information, you can check out the official Black Philanthropy Month website, which is blackphilanthropymonth.com. So feel free to check that out. There's a ton of information on there, and I hope it's something that all organizations can begin to celebrate and acknowledge every year. So with that, I'm going to invite Jessyca back. And Jessyca, I'd really like to start by hearing, you said a little bit about Chicago African Americans and philanthropy, but what are some of the specific goals that you all are working on right now?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that question. So CAPE is about a 20-year-old organization, mostly made up of volunteers who are leading this work in Chicago. And right now we're really in a shift where we're thinking about how this moment where there is an increased awareness of the need to fund Black communities and Black leadership, and really think about not just advancing, but achieving racial equity, how we can have a role in that work. So we do that in a couple of ways. So a lot of folks come to Chicago African Americans in Philanthropy because they're working either in a foundation or a nonprofit, and they want to be a part of these conversations, and maybe they're hitting some walls, some barriers, some challenges to advancing those conversations in their organization. So first and foremost, we're just that network of folks who understands that challenge and who are willing to listen and strategize with you and work together with you to advance that work. We also understand that for folks who are working in philanthropy, we need to have strong connections to community and community leaders so that our work and our strategies are really informed by those who are most impacted by the issues that we're trying to address. And so lots of opportunities, and I see some folks on the line who have spoken at some of our events, an opportunity for community leaders to come and share about their work they're doing, the strategies that they're doing, so that folks who are working in philanthropy can really be informed. We also have a couple of programs that we run. So we will be launching a 6-month learning opportunity called Dismantling White Supremacy, where we're really speaking directly to that issue. So leadership from UIC and from the MacArthur Foundation will be joining us to really teach for 6 months about structural racism, have an understanding of what those systems are, how they work, and how you can change your leadership by understanding them. So we just, on September 1st, we'll be launching applications for that opportunity. We also have a program called Trust Black Women, because what we learned is that there are a lot of Black women leading in this work. And often there's sort of that double battle of both race and gender to have your leadership acknowledged and have your ideas advanced. And so that's a mentoring and education program that we run. And so an opportunity for women to come together, be in community, but also receive mentoring and professional development. So a few avenues that we do that, but all based around sort of building leadership in the social sector, making sure that folks who are interested in this work have a home for that and an opportunity to collaborate together, and then ultimately shift resources in different ways. So changing the very way that philanthropy and giving works to make sure that resources are directed to communities of color.
Awesome, thank you. Those sound really exciting. I'm excited to hear about the learning opportunities about dismantling white supremacy. That's a conversation that we're trying to have in our own organization. And I think lots of organizations are having to try to figure out what white dominant culture is, how it deeply impacts our organizations, and what we can do about it. So we'll certainly check that out.
Please.
Can you talk to us a little bit about racial equity in philanthropy? How can we in the social sector work towards that and achieve that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a big, messy question, right? I think philanthropy has certainly come to acknowledge the role that it has in perpetuating some of these very systems that we're now trying to address and undo. And so I do think it is sort of a big, complicated question, but I do think there's a few avenues for that. So first and foremost, the social sector is a really significant employer of folks, in every state across the country. And so really thinking about how our internal practices, our organizational practices embrace racial equity is going to be really important for advancing that movement. We need to do that own internal work and reflection, changing our own internal practices so that we're really living out the values of racial equity. And so that's everything from inclusive workspaces and how we hire and how we promote and how we have this conversation, how we name race in our work. And I think that that is the starting point for really having an external facing conversation, right? So if we're an organization that is serving a community, we need to do that internal work so that when we go out into community, when we're working with folks outside of our organization, we really have an understanding of what it means to center race in our work, really have an understanding of what it means to interact with folks who may be alike or different from us in ways that are not contributing to trauma, contributing to oppression of those communities. And so I think it is a both internal and external work. And then really starting to change the way the system works, right? So in philanthropy, we know that even though there's been this call to action and change and willingness to shift resources to communities of color, that's still happening at a pretty small scale. That is happening because folks of color are not in the networks of most of the decision makers in philanthropy who tend to be white. We know that that is because the narratives that surround Black communities mean that they have not been trusted to develop their own strategies and have those strategies funded. And so we still have a lot of work to do in trusting those who are impacted by these challenges, letting them lead, letting them be the decision makers, rather than assuming that because of our power or status within an institution, we have greater knowledge of a challenge or how it should be solved.
Thank you. I think that's really helpful. I know one thing that we talk about as an organization is, we are addressing homelessness, and we understand that racial disparity and racial injustice is a huge driver of homelessness, right? And what does it mean to be accountable to the communities that we serve? I think that's a really important conversation. So thank you for bringing that up.
Absolutely.
I'd be interested in hearing more about the ways that you see people doing a really good job of investing in Black communities.
Yeah. So I think right now there's a real sort of shift in the philanthropy sector where we're really thinking about how we engage people directly. So I think the sort of furthest reaches of that are participatory grant making, where we are actually moving the decision making out of the hands of folks who are working in foundations to community members. And I think that's really right. That's the ideal practice, that you're bringing together community members and giving them the resources to make these decisions. It's certainly, you know, a new process, a process that we're testing and understanding, and it takes a lot of work, but I think it's an important one for engagement. And then I think you can just sort of think back from that, right? So if you're an organization who does not have the systems in place, is not ready to go all the way to participatory grant making, where you really are handing over power, which is, I think, the sort of ultimate goal we have, is to hand over power. Then thinking about how you are engaging community as decision makers. Is that an advisory board? Is that hiring folks who are directly impacted, who can inform your strategies and inform the way that you do the work? But I really do think it's about changing decision making and making sure that different people who really can drive solutions because they have the experience, are involved in the decision making that's happening.
Thank you. It's good to hear that. Again, that's, you know, a conversation that I'm hearing a lot of organizations have, is employing folks with lived experience, having folks with lived experience on our boards. And I think that is really important as we talk about power and who has, you know, the ability to make decisions about how we serve our communities.
Absolutely.
So this is a big question.
Sure.
How can organizations work to close the racial wealth gap? Because we know that it's very real and it's getting bigger, not smaller.
Yeah.
So how can organizations work to close that?
I do think that's like a real question of understanding systems, right? And I think particularly my experience, at least, is that in direct service, there's been sort of a shying away from talking about systems and really thinking, how can we reach one or two people at a time? What is that direct relationship? And that direct relationship is incredibly important, but we know that the inequities that we're seeing play out right now are based in systems. So I do think it is understanding how the work that we're all doing is shaped by the systems that we sit within. You know, in philanthropy, it's all based on tax systems, right? And so we really need to think about what is our system of approaching taxes and how has that led to inequities. We know that there are racial inequities embedded in the way that we have constructed our taxation system, right? And so how do we address those? How do we change those? How do we make that a more fair system that allows people to both access wealth, but also sustain it and maintain it? And I think you sort of build out from there, and sort of whatever system you're in, really understanding that at a state and federal level, there's decision making that happens, at a local level, there's decision making that happens, and we need to be challenging those systems and really understanding, like, there are long-term historical practices that have led to this, and sort of how do we want to address those. I also think when we talk about sort of funding and philanthropy, we need to think about how we're measuring impact and outcomes. And I think it's a really rich conversation that's also shifting. And so I am seeing more conversations about direct investment, about general operating support, right? So not tying grants and funding to a specific program and limiting it that way, but really thinking about general operating support. And why that's so important is that it allows an organization to be responsive to the current needs, right? I think we learned quite a bit during the pandemic about the way that, given the resources, given the opportunity to be responsive, organizations were able to shift their strategies, shift their practices to really meet what community needed. But if they're receiving funding that's earmarked and limited and tied to a specific program, they can't do the kind of responsive work that communities are actually looking for. So I do think it is looking at these systems, really understanding how systems work, how our work is tied to them, and how we need to change the systems to improve our work. And then really, again, being responsive and having the flexibility to do the work that is needed. So that racial wealth gap is both systematic, but also in the process of the way we're able to respond to community need in the short term.
Thank you. I'm not on our philanthropic engagement team, but I have heard lots about making sure we're supporting general operating budgets. I've heard that everywhere. I have one more follow-up question for you, and then I'm going to turn it over to folks because we do have a lot of our philanthropic engagement folks on this call and some of our Learning and Impact folks as well. I'm sure they have lots of questions. But I mentioned to you earlier that, we are an organization that receives a lot of philanthropic support, and we're an organization that's trying to figure out how to lean into racial equity as a whole. If you, I know this is hard, but if you could give us like 1 to 2 pieces of advice for us or any other organization that is trying to lean into this work, what would those like big pieces of advice be?
Yeah, so I think the first step is really creating a shared understanding of what an organization means by leaning into racial equity. Right. So I think that means a lot of different things to a lot of folks. And we all come in with our own experiences, our biases, our lived experience of race and racial equity. And so it is really important that an organization ground itself in some common understanding of what that means so that everyone's moving forward from the same starting place. So I think that's a big one. And I think for any organization, sort of getting that clarity is going to be really important. And then I think really understanding what that actually then means is a commitment, because it does mean that decision-making practices are going to change. And it does mean that solutions may look different from the work that's been done in the past. And that is a process for everyone to go through, right? To sort of let go of old ways of doing things, of ways that have been comfortable for doing things, and opening up the space for the conversation to change so that there is a different way of doing things. And I think it's important not to underestimate how challenging that can be for individuals and organizations, and really creating space for folks to go through that process and to go through that process together, so that when there is a new approach for how you're working with community, it's something that everyone's been brought along in, has that clear grounding and understanding of why it's being done, because you have that common definition of racial equity that you've started with, and has had the time to let go of those old ways of doing things and embrace those new ways of doing things.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And a good reminder, as many folks want the process to go faster and some folks want the process to go slower, that it is important that we have that shared understanding. So thank you.
Absolutely.
I want to open it up to others. What questions do you have for Jessyca?
So I first want to say I was really excited when I saw the announcement that 2 of my favorite people were engaging in conversation, Jessyca and Smash. So I'm going to put my question in the chat box. Do you think that the changes we have seen in philanthropy during the double pandemics of COVID-19 and racial upheaval will continue? Stuff like increased support for Black-led nonprofits, more general operating support, little to no reports required. Is this a phase, or do you think that this is a permanent shift?
Jamie, that's such a great question, and one I think we are all sort of waiting with bated breath to see how it plays out. I think we've seen the greatest shifts and the most willingness to sort of do away with complicated applications, to think about how to just move resources quickly amongst family foundations. And I am hopeful, like optimistic, that those practices will stay in place, because it not only lowered the burden and created more opportunities for access amongst grantees, it also changed the way folks work together. And what I'm hearing is that actually people preferred that. They also don't want to sit in a room and read applications for 10 hours a day. And like, that was not enjoyable for them either. So I am hopeful that some of those practices will shift. I think for larger institutional foundations, there's still an important conversation to have about, on the front end, sort of trust and what it means to trust community and how that changes practices, as well as a conversation about evaluations and metrics, right? So how can we be confident that like work is happening and going well and achieving outcomes without it being burdensome? So I still think there's some work to do there. I think what's been disappointing, honestly, is that there have been all of these calls, commitments to more funding, particularly for BIPOC-led organizations, and it hasn't translated into a significant shift, right? So if you're looking at some of the big national reports around giving, we're seeing small change. We're not seeing like really scaled change in the amount of resources that went to organizations or communities of color. And so I think still a push that we need to do there to really see the resources match the commitment. What I am hopeful about, though, is that this moment engaged more people in the conversation than it ever has before, right? So I don't think in the past we'd had such big public commitments, nor had we had people have access to the tools to hold people accountable for those commitments. And so I do think that is a unique moment that we're in. And so hopefully sort of those commitments being so public, the conversation being so public, along with people who had never really seen themselves as part of like the philanthropic sector or engaged in conversations about funding, wanting to be a part of those conversations, will start to create levels of accountability around this work that we haven't had in the past.
Smash, I want to be like Jessyca when I grow up.
Ditto. Thanks for that question, Jamie, and thanks, Jessyca.
Smash, I have a question. Jessyca, first, thanks so much for joining us today. I'm really excited about this. My question is, what would you say the best way for white-led organizations to support community BIPOC organizations in the doing similar work?
Yeah. So I do think it is like a real reflection and evaluation about what is everyone's best contribution or value add to the space, right? I think for so long, we have created a narrative that Black-led and BIPOC-led organizations have little to add to the space. And I think we need to have a real reevaluation about what everyone's value add is to the space, especially when there's organizations doing similar work. And so again, I do think that could be, and that could look like shifting some of the work that's happening for organizations to say, are we the best organization to be on the ground serving this community? Or is there another important role that we play in this space because we're white-led? And that might be leveraging our relationships for that kind of policy and strategy change that needs to happen so that the ecosystem that we operate in is best funded, best supported, works to really serve the communities that we want to have these positive outcomes for. So I do think it's sort of one, a reevaluation of what is our value add to the space? Where are we most needed? Where can we be most helpful? It doesn't mean exiting the space, but it might mean shifting the role in the space. And then I do think it is to really get deep and engage folks who are impacted by the work that you're doing to say, is this what you wanted? Right? Like, is this the support you needed, that you wanted, that you were looking for? If not, like, what would you actually want from us? And how can we help to be the partner that you're looking for in this like moment? I think it's so rare that we actually ask folks what they want or what they need. And we just assume because we're in these organizations and institutions that because we've done the research or because we have the degree that we have knowledge that community doesn't about the strategies that should be moving forward. And I think it's a real opportune moment where we can really do the deep kind of community engagement that I think we all are really interested in, but maybe have not found the space for in the past, and make sure that our programming, our work, our priorities are really aligned with community. Yeah.
Thanks, Melissa. That was a good question. And thanks, Jessyca.
Yeah.
What else? Who else has a question? While we're waiting, I'm going to do some shameless plugs for Jessyca here in the chat. Well, first, this is the KIP website, so Chicago African Americans in Philanthropy. And here's the website to Jessyca's business, because it sounds like we all should hire her.
Thanks, Brittany.
Yeah. Okay, any other questions, comments? I think this is a really great space to maybe ask questions that are hard, that we're kind of unsure how to ask. This is a space to do that.
If nobody else has a question, Jessyca, may I ask a second question?
Please.
And that is, I guess this is getting to the hard question. Talking to older donors about the importance of equity work, ones that may not be as comfortable with these issues. What suggestions, what advice do you have for people in development to do that?
Yeah, I do not envy folks in development at all. I do think that there's an important moment to meet people where they're at, right? I don't think for every donor are they ready for, and Brittany and I were just talking about this, for a community-centric fundraising. Not for every donor are they ready to like put their name and their face on equity work. But I do think it is important to bring them along on this journey. I think that while it's not going to be easy conversations, the harm is that we don't raise those conversations at all, and those donors get left behind. I think that I've, seen both things happen, where you raise the conversation and you get a surprising response, and you realize that donor is actually much more open to the conversation than you expected. And if you had never raised it, you wouldn't know that there was this opportunity. You also have those donors who are totally closed off on it. And I think it is about sort of walking them into this, inviting them into the conversation. In the work that I do, I have certainly been in the situation where I raise something and I get, a total brick wall about it. And 6 months later, all of a sudden someone has read something or someone has had an experience, and it starts to like open that door to the conversation. But if I hadn't raised it 6 months ago, there wouldn't be the opportunity for it later. So I do think it's sort of sussing out where are people at, having the confidence that like, yes, you may have this conversation and it may be surprisingly open, and that's a great opportunity. And if it's not surprisingly open and it is a challenging conversation, at least it was had, so that you can start to bring people and invite people into the conversation.
Any other questions? Also, feel free to pop questions in the chat if you have them.
Hi, I'm relatively new to the world of professional philanthropy. I just started in the development department of the American Heart Association here in Chicago. And I guess my question is, one, any tips for a new person on this side of the game? And then also two, there's so many important issues out there and organizations that, all need money. How do you balance asking for your org's needs with also realizing that there are other priorities for other organizations?
Absolutely. Great questions. I will sort of be upfront that most of my time, like while I have done some grant writing and work on the development side, most of my time has been on the funder side. So I just want to like give that caveat before I like say this, but I do think relationships are critical. And so I do think often in development and in philanthropy as well, like a lot of the work actually happens because you have a relationship with someone. And so I think having that, building that trusted network, finding those relationships, strengthening those relationships is really valuable time spent, because it can open so many doors to conversations about support. I think you never sort of know who's in your network and how much interest they might have in giving towards an issue until you sort of sat down and have that conversation with them. So I do think that that's really important. And then I do think the other piece of it is sort of understanding people's values and sort of meeting their values in this work. And so I do think, right, there's sort of an endless list of causes that folks can give to, but I think folks are really interested in giving to things that are aligned with their values. And so how can the giving that they're doing with you or the organization that you work at support their values and help them live out their values is a place where I have always found connection with folks around giving.
Jessyca, you talk like the grant application I need to write. So like if I could transcribe this and just add it into the needs statement, I would do it. So I just had two quick questions. How do we increase the representation of Black people in development and philanthropy, particularly development as like an employment force opportunity, workforce opportunity? And what advice would you give small Black-led nonprofits in this moment?
Yeah. Okay. So two great questions, as always, and tough ones, Jamie. So I think representation and development goes back to this sort of question about networks. I think there is a very, very strong and challenging narrative that Black people, people of color, don't give substantially, even though we know that Black households give 25% above the national average. But there is this really strong narrative that folks of color don't give. And so there has been less interest in bringing folks of color into development offices because Development is awesome and based on your networks, right? So I think we have some work to do around that narrative and really understanding and correcting the narrative around who gives, right? Because too often communities of color are seen as the beneficiaries of philanthropy rather than the benefactors, right? So some narrative change work to do, some just sort of proving folks wrong that like people of color can be great development folks and can bring in dollars, can meet the, meet the milestones that need to be met. I also think it is about the culture too, right? If you're coming in as a person to a development team and that narrative is strong, then you're also getting messages about your value to the team. And that could be challenging for anyone who's the person of color on a development team. And so I think really addressing what does it mean to have an inclusive culture where there's real collaboration within a development team so that folks want to be a part of that work. So I think there's some internal, external work to do, some narrative work to do, some culture work to do in the development space. I think, what I hear anecdotally from folks of color who've worked in that space is that they get in, they are judged differently for their outcomes than other folks. They have other barriers they're facing. They're sort of pigeonholed to a group of donors rather than having experience with all the donors. Or they have the very direct experience of a donor saying they don't want to work with them. And then they have to overcome that in their work. So I do think there's some things to happen there that will improve the ability for there to be greater representation. To your other question about small nonprofits, I think that there's a real opportunity to bring into the conversation sort of different ask for funders in this moment as they become increasingly aware of the need, not just for program related grants, but all other kinds of investments. There's a really interesting movement amongst a small number of foundations about actually helping nonprofits to build their reserves. It's such an incredible and I think important conversation because for so long, nonprofits who actually had some kind of reserves, some kind of savings, right, could actually talk about having 6 months Luna, were penalized for that. They were seen as not needing support, not needing funding, when that's actually a way to build a strong and sustainable organization. And so I do think for smaller nonprofits, there's an opportunity to have some different conversations to say, yes, we absolutely want your support for our programs, but we also want to build a reserve, and will you be a champion for us and help us build that reserve so we can sustain our work over the long term? I think that there is also an opportunity with some funders, not with every funder, of course, but with some funders to really be that conduit for that engagement and conversation with community and to sort of come to them with that. And I know that like Jamie in your work, like you're definitely bringing community into the conversation. And so to approach funders and say, here's what we're hearing from community, here are our priorities, how can we bring that into the work? How can that be a part of the strategy? How can we be a part of that feedback loop that's informing what strategy looks like moving forward?
Thanks, Jamie and Jessyca. Anyone else? What are y'all thinking? What questions do you have? All right, well, if folks don't have any more questions, Jessyca, is there anything else that you would like to share with us?
Sure. I think first and foremost, like I really appreciate building relationship with folks. And so please feel free to reach out. Like I'd love to have you all be a part of the community that I'm building around this work. I think this only happens when lots of folks are engaged in the conversation. And so if there are ways that I can be supporting you, or if there is part of this network that you want to be a part of, I'd really appreciate the connection. So just an ask to like reach out if there are other questions that come up or ways that we can collaborate on this work. And then I do think it's just, this is really, I think when folks think about racial equity, they're thinking about a destination or an outcome. And this is really a process, right? We are in deep learning about how to do this work. There are not like best practices the way there are in some other fields or around other work. And so I think just to be mindful and give yourself grace and give the folks around you some grace that we're all in a space of learning. We're all on this sort of process journey together, and there's not sort of an end goal, right? We are really just moving through this journey together and moving through this process together, and thinking about it like that, I think has really shifted the way we can come together to do this work.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jessyca. This has been wonderful. We are so grateful for your presence. We hope to continue to work with you and are excited to see what will continue to happen in terms of racial equity and philanthropy. So everyone, happy Black Philanthropy Month. Please celebrate in all of the ways. And like Jessyca said, feel free to reach out with any questions. And thank you all so much for being here. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.